Hey guys, I'm Sun. I'm a privacy and a security researcher, and you're watching the Privacy Guides. As you guys probably know by now, I'm going to be publishing an episode on how to self-host our own StrongSwan server shortly. But before we get there, there's two little episodes that I want to just slip in. The first one is I want to discuss how to choose a hosting provider for privacy. I mean, that's actually a pretty delicate subject since all of the internet traffic when we're self-hosting our own VPN is routed through that hosting provider. If that hosting provider is a bad actor, that becomes a honeypot. So, that privacy we're craving might actually turn against us. So I took that really seriously. Given I was going to be demoing how to set up StrongSwan on Debian, I wanted to do that on a provider that I trust. Now, to be quite honest and fully transparent here, the two providers that I'm going to be mentioning today are providers that I have a good feeling for, but I don't know for sure if they're good actors. I mean, it's always pretty damn hard to know if someone is faking it and it's essentially like a government spying agency behind or something like this. It's pretty hard to know, but my gut feeling is those two companies are actually good actors. So that's what I'm going to be talking today. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about how to benchmark servers, because as you're going to see in today's episode, two different providers can have very different performance, and some might be actually very good for VPNs but very poor for other applications. Now, if you guys are not into running your own servers, please skip today's episode and the ones on StrongSwan. I promise I'll be back shortly with content for you guys. As I mentioned, I'm going to be doing an episode on how to do backups, and I have a whole bunch more content coming. So without further ado, choosing the right hosting provider is critical. But what is a good hosting provider? Now, I have a few notes on my other screen because there's a lot of stuff that you need to think about. Now, the first thing is obviously governance. As I've been discussing over and over on this channel, governance is everything. If someone at the top is not good, doesn't care about privacy, everything underneath will be weak. So the first thing that we want to look at is who is behind a specific hosting provider. Do they care about privacy? What's their story? And that's something that we're going to look at right now. So the two providers that I'm going to be discussing today are 1984 and I don't know how to mention this. I always say Njalla because I like ninjas or something, but Njalla. Anyways, one of them, 1984, is based out of Iceland. I had a really strong craving for hosting my stuff in Iceland. Iceland has great privacy legislation, more on this in a second, but first things first, governance. So before actually, discovering or trying 1984, I actually inquired about who was behind that. And actually the founder of 1984 is also involved in political advocacy for privacy in Iceland. It's someone who's very involved, and 1984 is actually his company. I think he may have partners, but it's a private company that is operated by someone who is a very strong privacy and freedom of speech advocate. Now, Njalla is something that I discovered. It's a hosting provider that I discovered on privacytools.io. And when I started researching it, what I discovered is this is actually run by people who are very strong privacy advocates, people that were also associated to the Pirate Bay at times. This information I wasn't able to corroborate. They're very, very discreet, which can be great for privacy, but is also potentially a two-sided sword. I am hoping to get to talk with the founders of this company. I did talk with the founder of 1984, but overall, it's a trusted hosting provider in the privacy space. So governance is really important. As I mentioned also, ownership is very important. It's great that the CEO has good intentions, but if that company is now owned or co-owned by investors, that may not be so great. Investors can pressure a company to not care so much about privacy and focus on the margins. Both of those vendors are fully owned by their founders, so that's pretty cool. Now, location. So as I mentioned over and over, not all countries are equal when it comes to privacy and freedom of speech. Some countries are super shitty, like the United States and Canada, unfortunately. Some countries are much better. Iceland has a phenomenal reputation for privacy and freedom of speech. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks actually chose Iceland when they broke one of their biggest stories, and I believe that WikiLeaks has been hosted many times around in Iceland. I think nowadays it's kind of hosted all over the place to be very redundant and resilient to takedowns, but that's like a whole other story. So 1984 is based out of Iceland. It's an Icelandic company, and Njalla is a company. Let me see actually where that company is. Okay, so it's run by 1337 LLC based in Nevis. Now, where is Nevis actually? That's a good question. Nevis is a small island in the Caribbean Sea. So my gut feeling is that's kind of like a shell company. I know that the data centers are in Sweden, and Sweden is actually a pretty good place for privacy. That being said, Sweden is part of the 14 Eyes surveillance program, if my information is correct. So it's not the best, but it's not too bad. I mean, probably you guys followed the Pirate Bay saga, and it was actually held in courts in Sweden. Sweden has quite a history for promoting freedom of speech and resisting things. That being said, government has been pressured in the past. And if you haven't watched Away from Keyboard, it's a documentary on the Pirate Bay. It's pretty cool. Okay, moving along. Identity requirements. When you set up an account on 1984 or on Njalla, sorry if I'm messing this up. If someone knows how you say this, please let me know in the comments. 1984 only requires an email address. They couldn't care less to know who you really are unless you're doing something really shady. And if that's what you're planning on doing, I was going to say something bad. Please don't do illegal stuff. Illegal, I'll rephrase this. Please don't do immoral stuff, okay? So 1984 only needs an email. Njalla, if we go up to the sign up form, you can sign up using an email or XMPP, whatever that is. I haven't researched it yet, but they don't ask who you are and stuff like this, known as KYC, Know Your Customer. I have a little story for you actually. If we try signing up to OVH, now first things first, we get that warning because they're tracking the shit out of us. But the other thing is, when we go to create an account, the first thing they ask us is our first and last name. And I tried setting up an account at OVH because they do have a little bit of reputation around privacy. They're much better than Amazon, and it's a French company, so it's not an American company. But anyways, I tried signing up through my VPN, and my account was denied, and they asked me to send them my passport or some other form of identity. And they actually wanted me to send that by email in clear text. They didn't have PGP encryption. So I said, and that was it for me. Okay, so you want to have a provider that doesn't ask you for personal information. That is best for privacy. That being said, if you use your credit card, obviously you're blowing your cover. But if the provider is a good actor, I actually don't mind. I'm using my credit card on some of those providers, and that's totally fine. But if we want more anonymity, especially if we're advocating for things in countries that are a little sensitive, well, it's great to be able to just sign up using an email and never use a credit card, which brings me to payment requirements. Both 1984 and Njalla can use Bitcoin payments. So you don't need to pay with a payment method that can be linked back to you. Now, I might create content specific to Bitcoin in the future, but obviously Bitcoin is not private by default. It definitely adds privacy. Using Bitcoin as a payment method to be anonymous requires quite a bit of technical know-how. More on this perhaps in future episodes. If you're down for Bitcoin episodes, let me know in the comments. Two-factor authentication. If we're going to be hosting, or terminating all of our VPN traffic through that hosting provider, obviously we want to make sure that someone cannot brute force their way into our account and then take over our servers. To that effect, we absolutely want that provider to have 2FA, two-factor authentication. Now, when it comes to two-factor authentication, not all 2FA is equal. SMS 2FA is super shitty. I mentioned that in the episodes on two-factor authentication. I'll link them in the description. Moving on, actually, I'll go with my personal favorite. My personal favorite is time-based one-time password, better known as TOTP. The cool thing with TOTP, and that's what Google Authenticator uses, by the way, it's an open source protocol, not protocol, I should say standard probably. It's an open source standard for time-based two-factor authentication. It uses a hash and the current time to derive a 6-digit token that we then use that is only valid for about a minute. That is great, but it's great because A, it's open, and B, and that's the most important part, those hashes can be backed up in a whole bunch of ways. More on this in future episodes, but backups. If you want to be sovereign, and if a hosting provider is implementing 2FA properly, if you lose both your password and your 2FA device, you should be locked out of your account. It shouldn't be possible to just like email them and then they unlock it. That's the whole point of two-factor authentication. So time-based one-time passwords can be backed up, which is great. Now, unfortunately, 1984 only supports something called Yubico OTP, so Yubico one-time password. The problem with that is A, it cannot be backed up, and B, part of the unique ID that is sent to all providers you use that YubiKey for. Okay, YubiKeys, for people who don't know what it is, this is what a YubiKey looks like. It's like a little USB stick. When you press the button, it sends that OTP to that hosting provider. Now, part of that ID is always the same for all different providers you use. So using that means of 2FA actually leaks your identity to multiple people, which is really shitty. So no backups, that's super bad. And identity leakage potential, so that's also bad. So I did get in touch with the people at 1984, and they are considering implementing time-based one-time password. I would be so grateful if they did that. Now, Njalla has time-based one-time password, which is great. Performance and dedicated resource allocation. So that's a really important one, and that's actually going to be the subject of tomorrow's episode on how to benchmark servers. I'm going to teach you guys how to actually do this on different vendors. And as you'll see, different vendors are incredibly different from a benchmark perspective. So to just throw numbers at you in a nutshell, not real numbers, but just to give you a sense of things, 1984 is about 50 times faster from a disk input-output performance standpoint. So SSDs at 1984 are super performant, not like incredible performant. I mean, the base plan that I'm going to be suggesting is about $5 a month, so we cannot expect that much. But performance compares to DigitalOcean, which is pretty impressive. Now, networking, on the other hand, is not so great at 1984 because of how Iceland works. The backbones to the internet that connect, continents to Iceland, those backbones are very expensive from a bandwidth perspective. So network speeds is actually limited to 100 megabits when you're dealing with 1984. Now, Njalla, on the other hand, has horrible disk I/O performance, okay? Like, actually kind of too slow for most things. I would never run a database, for instance, on Njalla, at least on the entry plan, which is about $15 a month. That being said, networking speed blew my mind. I don't know if all of their VPS servers are that performant, but actually, it's hard for me to acknowledge that this can be true, but about 6 gigabits. It's so fast. So instead of 100, it's 6,000. So it's about 50 times faster if my maths are correct. I mean, it's so incredibly fast that you can just burst through the 1.5 terabytes of allocated bandwidth a month. That being said, Njalla for a VPN is phenomenal. And it's actually so great that we can probably have about 5 to 10 users using it on super high speed home internet and still not cap it. So that's like amazing. That being said, CPU and memory is ordinary at Njalla, and disk I/O, as I said, is really, really bad. Even installing packages using APT is kind of painful. I did reach out to them to inquire about that, and they didn't answer. Okay, the next thing up, and by the way, when I discussed resource allocation, what I just did, I'll maybe edit this out. Over provisioning is a big plague in the world of virtual private servers. Hosting providers, to make more money, will over allocate users to server resources. That means that instead of having, for instance, 10 users because there's 10 cores in the CPU, they'll put 20 users. And all users will be assigned one core, which means they actually get half a core. And if resource allocation is not done properly, someone could clog the system and then all other users get penalized. So I really like it when VPS providers can guarantee specific resources. So far, both 1984 and Njalla are pretty reliable or stable from a resource or performance perspective. Next up, virtualization type. Not all VPS providers have the same kind of virtualization stack. So what virtualization is, to people who don't know, computers are super powerful nowadays. The computer you have at home, this MacBook Pro here, is very powerful. For a server or say a VPN endpoint, you don't need something that powerful. So what people are doing now, they're using something called KVM often, which virtualizes those resources and allows for multiple operating systems to run on one given computer. That is great. That's what enabled virtual private servers in the first place. So VPS is a really affordable way of renting a little piece of a server, which brings down the price. Now, the problem is KVM is something that is pretty great. It's used on most hosting providers, but some, such as Njalla, use containers such as LXD. Containers do not give as much control to the user because containers, all users on a containerized, if that's a word, VPS architecture share the same kernel. So that means that there's a whole bunch of things that you cannot do. And one of them, at least on Njalla, perhaps it's for everyone, is you cannot have a VNC connection to the actual hypervisor. So we cannot install custom images. We cannot, run our own Debian install and stuff like this. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. So KVM versus, LXD, I tend to prefer KVM. It's more isolated. I did confirm that on security.stackexchange, and, consensus was that KVM is better. Now, almost last but not least, customer support. Things go wrong. If you have one of those servers in production, something might happen, and you want to have customer support that is responsive, and ideally that supports PGP, meaning that we can encrypt messages that we're sending to the support. Right now, that I'm aware of, 1984 does not support encrypting emails that are sent to them. That being said, their support is pretty good. It's not fast. It can take many hours before they answer, but at least so far they always answer. It's not the case for Njalla. I've had really flaky support. When they do answer, they're good. I'm sure they're very competent, but they don't apparently answer to all emails or trouble tickets. And actually at one point I was kind of like reinitiating an auto install, and it broke, and it took 6 to 8 hours before they answered. So that means I would have had like huge downtime if that was a production server. Thankfully, I was just doing tests. And last is price. Price is important. There's a lot of providers such as Orange in Iceland that exist. Actually, let's just go and look at that. Orange Iceland. Yeah, so for instance, Icelandic web hosting with free speech. I'm sure Orange is a decent provider, and it actually ticks a few of the boxes. It does accept Bitcoin payment, for instance, but look at this. If we go to web hosting and VPS and we take the entry level plan, it's 30 euros, so like a little over 30 USD a month for 512 megabytes of RAM. only 16 gigabytes of storage. That's cool, but like 200 gigabytes of transfer that's like absurdly expensive. I would never be able to sell a value proposition like this to you guys. Thankfully, 1984 is $5 and Njalla is about 15. And given Njalla could run multiple VPN clients on the same server, I mean, we can actually pool a few users and get that cost down to roughly the same for $5 in the context of a VPN. Whew, that was a lot of information. I guess probably a lot of you kind of like zoned out and started watching something else. I mean, this is a lot, but as you can see, everything I just mentioned, all of this required research, and all of this is something that we have to keep in mind when we're choosing a hosting provider for our projects. Okay, so I'll see you guys tomorrow when I'm going to discuss how to benchmark servers. I mentioned how 1984 is much better from a disk I/O perspective, and how Njalla is much better from a networking perspective. And I kind of want to show you guys how to figure this stuff out. Maybe you guys know providers that you want to recommend. I would be super happy to learn about more privacy conscious hosting providers. Yeah, see you soon. Bye.